Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining CEN's panel Grid Modernization, Deploying Clean Energy Solutions for a Thriving Economy webinar. My name is Salome Garcia. I am the Director of Policy and Programming at CEN. CEN is the Conservative Energy Network. We are a nonprofit organization championing secure, reliable, affordable, clean American energy. If you want to learn a little bit more about CEN, please visit our website. We're going to put the link on the chat. So I am really excited to introduce today's panelists. They are incredible partners that we have the privilege of working with. So first, I'm going to introduce Bryn Baker. She is CEBA's Senior Director of Market and Policy Innovation, leading CEBA's work to influence policies that expand opportunities and accelerate new approaches that allow all large energy buyers to access cost-competitive clean energy through an expanded and modernized grid. Secondly, we have Meredith Pringle. She specializes in resilience strategies and assessments for military, government, and civilian partners nationwide. Meredith designed Converge strategies as approach to regional resilience workshops, specifically focusing on developing project concepts to address critical infrastructure vulnerabilities through partnerships with various stakeholders, airports, utilities, communities, cities, states, governments, and of course, the U.S. Department of Defense. And then finally, we have Carrie Zalewski is the Vice President of Transmission and Electricity Markets for American Clean Power, where she advances clean energy through policies that ensure fair access to the electricity market. Each of these organizations does phenomenal work across the entire energy spectrum. They've all recently released various studies showing the need for expanded transmission for clean energy deployment, for grid reliability, and of course, for economic growth. So today, each of our panelists is going to share insights from their latest research, discuss a little bit about what we're seeing across the state of our electricity grid, and then we're all going to highlight some, unique opportunities and challenges in modernizing the grid to meet the demands of our rapidly evolving economy. So we're first going to begin with some brief presentations from each of our panelists, and then we'll go into a moderated discussion. And of course, please utilize the Q&A feature in the bottom of the webinar. As a reminder, you can submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature, and then all of our panelists will be able to address their questions either orally, or they can also just write back in the chat. So definitely encourage you to use that feature. So first, I'm going to kick it off to Bryn Baker from CEBA.
Great. Well, let me pull up some slides here just to kick it off momentarily. Great. Can folks see this full screen? Almost. There we go. Well, again, my name is Bryn Baker, Senior Director for Policy. CEBA is a customer-oriented organization with about 400 members that collectively have about 20 trillion in market cap. So these are the big buyers. These are large energy buyers from every major sector. And to help set the stage here a little bit, what Carrie was going to cover from ACP is sort of a bigger, large load demand forecast. What I wanted to share from our perspective was we all know that there's a deluge of demand coming, and there's a big questions around how do we meet that demand. We were specifically interested, since we're the Clean Energy Buyers Association, how much demand is there for clean as we look out across the landscape, across states? And let's see if I can figure out how to move the slide forward. There we go. The big question that I think we wanted to tackle with a study that we released back in February, partnered with Wood Mackenzie, was how much demand is there for clean power specifically? And the answer is it's big. It's 275 gigawatts over the next decade from the Fortune 1000. And that's to meet their public commitments that these companies have set out, not just to 2035, some of them go beyond that, but to try to more concretely say, how much clean power do we really need? 275 is the big number over the next decade or so. That's a combination of meeting both new demand and I think really important to this conversation is shifting existing loads to clean power. And in fact, more than half of that 275 gigawatts is meeting demand from existing loads. So when we talk about the transition underway, but what's really an energy expansion, we have to include both how are we meeting new demand and then how are we recognizing that businesses increasingly do want to be powered with carbon emissions-free sources of power. The thing I would note about this study, though, is that Wood Mackenzie took a pretty conservative estimate of overall load growth because they assumed that there were supply chain and other constraints like permitting that ultimately rein in how much we can build and how fast. So I think Carrie's going to share some numbers that are going to look a lot bigger than this when you're looking at demand growth. That's taking into account how much is load requesting to build. When you sort of put this screen on how much can we actually build, you're going to get a lesser number. The other question that we wanted to ask, though, was where would all of this clean energy deployment end up? And we predict that a lot of it will follow some historic procurement patterns. About 70% of it's likely headed to ERCOT, MISO, and PJM because those are the markets where there is generally an ability to sign power purchase agreements, which is the vast majority of what corporates are procuring in the marketplace. So that's in line with historic procurement. That means that where the load may go does not necessarily line up with where they may sign power purchase agreements. The second thing that I wanted to touch on was just sort of what's the broader set of trends that are shaping business procurement, which is such a huge part of the clean energy market now. We just recently announced that corporate procurement has now topped 100 gigawatts of new utility scale contracts for carbon emissions free power. Last year was the biggest year on record for corporate procurement, despite significant headwinds on cost, certainly a range of market uncertainties. And more than half of that capacity is now operating. What's interesting is more than 70% of it is contracted from solar. So that is a huge part of the market. But really importantly, we also saw future nuclear contracts, had a huge year last year with 1.5 gigawatts, and really other entrants in the clean firm power space, things like enhanced geothermal. You can see here a 300% increase in battery storage. And so that's really showing that there's a strong pivot happening to clean firm power sources. And that's directly in recognition that a lot of these loads coming on are flat and dense. It's not just data centers, we're talking about manufacturing, but data centers in particular don't have a lot of flexibility. So they're now going out into the market and signaling, here's what we need to buy today, and here's what we need to be able to buy tomorrow. And so nuclear and some of these other advanced clean firm power sources are starting to come into the market in a more concerted way. Then I think the real question is, what scale of power sources can really meet all of this demand? What's in the toolkit right now? What are the costs? How fast can you build them? Because in this fast-paced environment, we can't afford to make uneconomic choices. And so if you look at it by the numbers, I just wanted to show this up here also to ground us for the rest of the conversation because, for example, this year, we're building about 4 gigawatts of gas. That's not the scale of what is going to meet the demand at the moment. There's, of course, a huge push to make all of that happen faster, but the reality is gas turbines are sold out for 4 to 5 years, and you also need substantial new pipeline capacity, which takes time to build. So if you're looking at batteries, on the other hand, we're building about 19 gigawatts of batteries this year. That's 4x of what we're adding on gas. And then solar had its biggest year ever last year with about 50 gigawatts of deployment. So if you look at the generation interconnection queue, which is what this chart shows, this is updated from 2024, there's over a gig of solar and battery storage each. Gas makes up about 3% of what's in the queue. So even if you knock out 90% of the solar and batteries in the queue, you'd still build 200 gigawatts of solar and batteries, which is approaching the scale of the demand in the next couple of years. And importantly, solar and battery equipment are more available than gas. So to be clear, we're going to need all of the options on the table, but we have to look at what we can build fastest and cheapest. And if you're looking at some of the cost numbers, just to round this out, if you look at Wood Mackenzie, gas plants have recently topped $2,200 a kilowatt. Batteries after tariffs are around $800 a kilowatt, and solar, Carrie, you can correct me if you've got different numbers, but somewhere around 1,300 per kilowatt. So combined, solar and batteries are coming in less than gas, generally speaking, and you typically don't build solar and batteries one-to-one as well. So looking at all these dynamics is really important when we're sort of trying to set the table of we've got massive economic opportunities coming in the form of growing demand. It's obviously a massive challenge to put together all the pieces of the generation resources that you're going to need to meet all of that. We have to look at what is actually available, both in terms of technology and cost, to put together an optimized portfolio of that. And I think as we're going to turn to shortly, solving the generation piece is one part of this. You also have to move it. And so that's going to take us straight into the conversation about transmission to move all that generation that we're going to have to build. So I'll pause there and I think probably turn it over to Carrie next.
And Bryn, also there are some sort of slide-specific questions in the Q&A if you want to answer that via the chat.
The answer on the demand growth forecast, it does take into account data centers. So underlying that load growth forecast is an estimate of about 7% compound annual growth rate in large load sectors, which includes data centers, but not exclusively. I mean, that includes advanced manufacturing and a few other sectors, although in the short run, a lot of it is definitely driven by data centers. On the nuclear procurement, so the question mentions Vogtle. So that plant was procured by Southern Company. The procurements in the slide that I showed, which are corporate procurements, were either forward announcements from companies that the data center companies, for the most part, made these announcements, are going to buy from directly. So more in the small modular reactor segment of the industry, not large scale Vogtle style reactors. And those are forward contracts. So you might expect those types of nuclear procurements to actually come on post 2030 rather than announcements of new nuclear plants that have just come online and are generating electricity today.
Thank you so much, Bryn. And if any other questions pop up, please continue to use that Q&A. And then handing it off to Carrie.
Great. My name is Carrie Zalewski. I'm with the American Clean Power Association, or ACP, as we call ourselves. ACP builds the big stuff on the grid. We are a group of diverse technologies: wind, solar, storage, transmission, hydrogen, with a group of diverse business models. We have members that have gas in their portfolio, for example, but our mission is to ensure that clean energy has fair access to the grid, and thinking of a holistic 360 view of what's happening in the markets and with tariffs and on the Hill and in the States. It really is an honor to be here with Bryn, Meredith, and Salome. I'm here to briefly talk about the national demand study, the national power demand study that we did. The good news is it dovetails nicely with what Bryn said and is consistent. So that means our outcomes are more accurate. I wanted to note that this is a study that S&P Global did and ACP commissioned. And I wanted to flag that we had a lot of support and peer review of this study, certainly from CEBA, but also from the Alliance to Save Energy, the Nuclear Energy Institute, the American Petroleum Institute. We really are trying to get all perspectives when we push out these studies. So it was something important to flag. So no surprise, demand is on the rise. There's all kinds of numbers that I've seen floated around, but per our study, we see that the demand is rising between 35 and 50% between 2024 is when the study was conducted to 2040. The next 5 years pose a major risk of supply and demand. We're seeing this in the markets. We see a call from PJM of issues with resource adequacy in as soon as 2029. And the near-term drivers like manufacturing and large industrial loads, which Bryn mentioned, can be built faster than generation. So it's quicker and easier to build a data center than it is to both build and interconnect and energize some of the generation that we need on in in the next couple of years. The study also noted that we cannot forget the long-term drivers that include electrification and heating of homes, for example. This will be something that will have a major impact on how these things all play out. So the map I have is of the 7 ISO RTOs, and you'll see 2 yellow stars, one on ERCAT and PJM. The study indicated that these 2 markets are the ones that are going to see the quickest rises in demand, and so they have to kind of figure out the solution quickly. They obviously are very different for a variety of reasons, so it'll be interesting to see how both fare in this change of demand in the next couple of years. All right. So I tried to put some of the challenges at high level of the study. Bryn talked a bit about this, but the study also indicates that supply chain is an issue. I want to say that all industries have supply chain issues, all technologies. And then there's obviously a lot of interesting things happening with tariffs that I think are going to impact some of these issues as well. And also there's supply chain issues for the grid as a whole. Transformers are very hard to obtain, but gas is, there's more and more data points that this supply chain issue is really coming to head. Bryn mentioned this, but we heard John Ketchum, the CEO of NextEra, talk about this in a quarterly earnings. He's not seeing any robust gas build out until 2030. We saw some projects that were pulled out of the Texas Energy Fund citing supply chain issues. So we're seeing it now. It's not just something in the future, it's something happening now. The study also noted that nuclear and other advanced technologies like geothermal are great, but they have long lead times and the economics can be tough sometimes. Batteries can, if supply chains cooperate, can be built pretty quickly. They can be built as quickly as 18 months, but they need the right market signals, both capacity, ancillary services. They need these signals to know where to build and what duration to build at. We actually were just looking at the different durations of batteries in different markets. ERCOT has a shorter duration of average of 1 hour to maybe 2 hours, where CAISO has more of a longer duration battery average of 4 hours. And that's because of price signals. It's not because battery technology is different in those 2 states. It's because of the signal that the market is sending. So that's why the market signals are so incredibly important. And then the bottom 3 points pertain to all types of energy, conflicting economic policy and reliability priorities. The pendulum swinging of priorities and policies is not good for business. It creates uncertainty and an inability for a lot of these developers to make decisions of how much to build, where to build, and in both swings, both directions. Any way it swings, it creates uncertainty. Again, much like all the change in the tariff are creating uncertainty in the markets. Interconnection will always be an issue. You can build a thing, but if you can't connect and energize and let the electrons flow, that will always remain to be a problem. Siting and permitting is same thing. There's a lot of work to be done in siting and permitting, and major transmission reform is needed. Okay, some policy options that were brought up in the study. Optimizing study processes and prevent speculative projects in the queue. There was a FERC order 2023, that worked to solve some of these issues of the lowest hanging fruit, but there is so much more work to be done. This is just a start, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. There's a couple on here. Better use of AI for planning, for example. We're starting to see some of this being used by the markets, but we need more of this type of technology. We need to make sure that we're getting rid of speculative projects, and there's a couple of policies that are being worked on, I know at FERC, but also in Order 2023 just touches on this stuff. Improve interconnection access and flexibility. The study talks about allowing generators to initially pursue ERIS, which is Energy Resource Interconnection Service, with a pathway to gain NRIS, or Network Resource Interconnection Service. This is like the Connect and Manage program that you see in ERCOT. Things are connecting quickly in ERCOT for a variety of reasons, but part of it is this ability to connect, manage, and potentially be curtailed, but to connect quicker. And this is one of the things that the study recommended exploring more. Exploring co-location of supply and large loads. This is a very hot topic at FERC. There's a lot to be worked out, but it certainly is something that is being explored and could be an important solution. Support a diversified generation mix. There's so much that can be said about the diversification of generation mix, not just for supply chain issues. So if there's a supply chain issue of one type of generation and we're trying to build just that one type, it creates a lot of problems. But also, from my vantage point, I'm seeing better outcomes for affordability and reliability when there is a diversified generation mix. We're seeing really interesting outcomes in markets like ERCOT that have a diversification of generation versus other markets who just depend on one resource heavily. The next one is conduct grid upgrades, grow the grid, kind of mentioned in the earlier slide. And then finally, enhance energy efficiency and strengthen demand side management. Bryn was kind of touching on this, but there's a lot of interesting studies and data coming out. There's a Nicholas Institute study that recently came out that found that looking at the 22 balancing authorities, that they could handle as much as 76 to 126 gigawatts if the new load could be curtailed up to 0.25% to 1% of their max uptime. That sounds like a really small number, but as Bryn alluded to, that actually might be impossible for certain types of load. So there's lots more to look into on the demand side as well. All right, key takeaways. Diversification of portfolio is required, again, both for reliability and affordability, but also for other things like supply chain. The study says that by 2040 that we'll need net additions of 60 to 100 gigawatts. That's supposed to be a gas plant on my icons. It looks a little bit like nuclear, but it's supposed to indicate that that's gas. And then 900 of renewables plus storage. And then the final takeaway, again, no surprise to anyone, the stakes are high and failure could be catastrophic. That's all I have in my study.
Thank you, Carrie. We have two questions on the chat. The first one is, what do the color codes mean? And that one's referring to the map of the United States with the different sort of color combo. Do you want to address that real quick?
Yeah, sure. That is the 7 ISOs. MISO, PJM. These are organized markets that run an energy market and have all kinds of mechanisms, whether it's a day ahead market or an hourly market or a capacity market. So these are obviously different than the market you think on Wall Street, but it has it creates price bids for different types of resources that you can bid in, and the idea is to bring down costs so that the generation resource that can bid the lowest will win out. So it's different regions in the country. They're also balancing markets that I mentioned as well. Further explain how market signals impact battery storage. You mentioned batteries can retain energy longer. Yeah, so there are all different types of products. There are, for example, there's capacity accreditation that will give you a certain amount of value for a certain type of resource. This is something determined by each of the ISOs. And like, for example, in PJM, they have a capacity accreditation for a 4-hour battery. They specifically say 4-hour. They do not have a market signal for a multi-day battery that does exist, but it's not in commercial scale. So if a market really values a multi-day long duration battery, for example, they could create a product to pay that type of resource either through the capacity market or through ancillary services. So it just means that you get paid more because the market thinks you bring extra value for the type of resource you are. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much. And then finally, I'll hand it over to Meredith for her intro remarks.
Yes, you guys are seeing my screen, I think. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Meredith Pringle. I'm a principal at Converge Strategies. We are a consulting firm that works at the intersection of clean energy resilience and national security. And I primarily lead our Department of Defense regional resilience efforts. So how Department of Defense installations in their communities to work together to enhance their national security posture as well as their energy security posture. I've been working with the department for close to 15 years and helping them to enhance their security resilience and their energy resilience posture. And the objectives remain the same. We want to ensure our infrastructure and installations can support the national defense objectives, but the way that the department is thinking about their mission and their reliance on the grid has really shifted. For a long time, they took a posture of what we call inside the fence line. So they are concerned with on-site generation, your generators, your battery systems, even microgrids, just to keep the lights on inside the fence, as the name says. And over the past several years, with the increase of cyber attacks, natural disasters, determined adversaries, aging infrastructure, the Department of Defense is becoming increasingly aware of how much they rely on critical infrastructure sectors that they do not have control over, the bulk electric system being one of those, and those grids and those wires and lines that come in, and they cannot do anything, right? They can't control the maintenance, they can't control the upkeep. That is stuff that is out of their control, but is critical to the mission of the Department of Defense that they're trying to conduct every day for our national security. So we at Converge Strategies have worked with the Association of Defense Communities to develop this most recent report called Unleashing the Grid, Energy Dominance for National Security. And as I alluded to, the Department of Defense is now beginning to treat that bulk electric system as an extension of the mission and the weapons platform. The way that the military conducts their missions has changed. There is more and more work being done in the United States on our installations here. You can think of something as basic as your voice over IP phones, being able to pick up and call someone, to the most advanced, reconnaissance and intelligence mission gathering that relies on communications and electric infrastructure, as well as the support for the folks that are on base doing those missions. In addition to people on base, the communities in which those installations are located are reliant on that same grid. And 2/3 of our troops do not live on the installation, neither do many of the civilian or contractor workforce. And they're relying on those hospitals, those schools, those grocery stores off the installation to keep the power on. That's where their families live. So when you show up to work and the power's on where you're working, but the power might not be on at home, you may not have 100% concentration, for example, if there was a recent disaster or something like that. So keeping those community pillars online and running in the event of some sort of outage is really critical to the success of our national security as well. So this report is really grounded in the idea that prioritizing investment in our transmission system is essential to the national defense posture. Recently, we saw those impacts of Hurricane Helene, which devastated Southern Company's service area, which has a lot of military installations, as well as Winter Storm Uri, which had dozens of military installations in Texas lose power. So it's really not a stretch to see that the transmission grid is highly vulnerable to this disruption, and these events have significant consequences on the Department of Defense to achieve the national security mission. So this report covers big topics like why is transmission important to national defense? How does the department have an influence over the grid? What kind of planning can we take a part of? How is the regulatory process involved? And I skipped over the fourth kind of pillar here because I think that's the most important. This is not just admiring the problem. We had an earlier report called Trend, which kind of just laid out a lot of the things that I just spoke about. This report is a deeper dive, and it includes a framework for defense stakeholders whom we consider the installations themselves, the communities in which they serve, anyone that's passionate about it, and the utility companies that they are partners with. We have laid out this framework so they can assess their need for transmission expansion and have in their back pocket things to talk about when they go and advocate for that sort of thing. So here are some of the questions that we lay out for those defense communities to think about. You guys can read the slide and hopefully read the report and see what's more on there. But yeah, this is on unleashthegrid.org. You can find the report. There's a bunch of other resources there. And I know we'll probably talk about, what a call to action is for some of these stakeholders later and what they can do. But we're really excited about this and feel like it comes at a great time, especially all that Carrie and Bryn laid out in terms of growth expectations.
Thank you so much, Meredith, and all of our panelists for your intro statements. So I'm going to get started with a couple of questions. I'll reference one person, and then anybody else from the panel, please feel free to respond as well. But my first question is to you, Bryn. What sort of current federal policies are in the works that deal with that economic benefit of sort of new, more robust transmission grid? And how do you see these policies being successfully implemented?
I think the starting point is to recognize that we've underbuilt the grid for this moment, and we're overpaying for the types of transmission that we've been building. We've not built that many miles of long distance, high voltage transmission. And transmission and distribution are the fastest rising portion of bills across the country. So recognizing that we've got a lot of transmission bottlenecks, and that unlocks a lot of other things. We've got to be on the pathway to building a bigger grid. The first thing I think of in terms of federal policies that are active right now is a big order that came out of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission last year, known as Order 1920. It requires transmission planning regions to look out over a longer term time horizon. And, places were kind of all over the map on this, but it says we need to look out at least 20 years to plan transmission and account for a more common set of economic factors beyond just looking at reliability needs, which remain core. From our perspective, we strongly support this type of approach, which is now in the implementation phase, because transmission lines are typically 40+ year assets or longer. And so you really do need to look out over a longer term planning horizon to build this bigger system, especially as we're looking at a sustained period of economic and electricity demand growth. Businesses are going to locate where there is grid capacity, and that capacity is vanishing quickly. So the states and regions that are proactively planning to build a bigger grid most cost efficiently are best positioned to capture this economic growth from these growing and innovative industries. The reality is that if we want to reduce the rate of increase of transmission and distribution costs within bills, we need to be planning the most cost-efficient transmission that we can. Congestion costs have doubled across the country in recent years. We can't clear these generator interconnection queues fast enough because of transmission bottlenecks. If you're looking at places like PJM, which is another grid operator region in the Mid-Atlantic, capacity auction prices have gone through the roof. All of these things tie back to a suboptimal process for increasing the amount of transmission capacity that we're building that ultimately enables getting all this new generation onto the system that we need. Transmission is the linchpin. So doing this regional planning approach, we view as being really critical. And such a big part of that conversation is helping states and regions see that from a customer perspective, there are much larger economic benefits to planning proactively, working together for the most efficient lines on the system. So that's the big one. I mean, there are certainly other things that could and should be done at the federal level that can facilitate things like greater transfer capacity across the country for building grid resilience. The other federal policy discussion that is moving slow at the moment, I would say, is around permitting reform. We need permitting reform both for transmission and generation. A big run at this was made last year, just couldn't quite get across the finish line. We don't see immediate prospects for this right now, given other budget and other considerations that are pending in the front of the line. But we're building back to this discussion around permitting reform because we have to be able to build infrastructure faster. So those are the highlights I'd hit.
Thank you so much, Bryn. And I think that actually ties really well to the next question that I had, which is for Carrie. Carrie, we've heard a lot about sort of what type of infrastructure investments we have to make to keep affordability front and center. So given ACP's efforts in conveying the importance of affordable energy, what do you think is one of those like most important messages, especially at this time, regarding the impacts of up and coming clean energy reliability solutions?
Yeah, so first I'll start by saying that all generation resources have their strengths and weaknesses. Some are weather dependent, some are fuel dependent, some are very expensive to build, some have lengthy refueling processes. But if we can find a way to take advantage of the collective strengths and weaknesses of all the resources, then we really can build out the most affordable, reliable grid. If I were to build a grid from scratch, I was kind of mentioning this before, I would not build a grid with 100% wind or 100% gas or 100% nuclear. What I'm seeing as far as reliability, and by the way, reliability and affordability go hand in hand, and I can speak a little bit more to why I say that. But if I were to build a grid from scratch, I would have a healthy mix of all the resources. I would have wind and solar and storage. Nuclear is great, baseload. I'd throw some gas on there for times when we really need it. But you can't always predict the way that the weather will move, and you cannot predict the way that people will use the system. So if you have all resources on at all times, then you have the best outcome. We did a study of how battery storage was doing in Texas. Texas is going gangbusters. They are building the most things. I talked to you about their Connect and Manage program. It's really interesting. ERCOT's very interesting because they're not driven by policy. They're not driven by clean energy policy. They're driven by economics and by having a true robust market. And things are getting built. We always put out our state of the market of what's getting built and where, and ERCOT's blowing everything out of the water, especially on storage. So we did a study that showed when Texas put on 5 gigawatts of energy storage in 1 year, it helped Texans save $750 million in energy cost reductions. That's because the cost of your bills are set on the peaking days. And so when things are really, really tight and prices go really, really high because everyone needs it, sometimes gas is cheap and available. Sometimes it's not. Usually gas prices start peaking. So storage can come in and offer up a cheaper availability of electrons. So really it's that like push and pull of those two resources. Same thing, we see a lot of wind and SPP, and which is another market. I'm sorry, I keep using all of these acronyms. SPP is another market, which is like a little west of Midwest. They have a lot of wind. And they are seeing, in some of these like really egregious winter storm days, the wind is going crazy and it's creating all of this cheap power. And if you link that with storage, you can, if its price is negative, you can store it. So really we're seeing increase of reliability when you have this diversity of resources. And at the same token, you see the prices go down, the reflection on people's bills. And I guess I'll just one more thing to the point of levelized cost of energy. Really solar, and Bryn, you were kind of touching on this, solar really is competitive of gas. Even without subsidies, we get that question a lot. Obviously, the subsidies help in a lot of good ways, but solar has come down. It's much more efficient, much less costly. So then when you link it to even some of these hybrid approaches, you can like when you're just comparing apples to apples, it is cheaper to build.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I want to pivot the conversation just a little bit to Meredith. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what are some new innovative policy or programs that is supporting conversations regarding military innovation with grid security?
Yeah, thanks. Has been a lot of focus, as I, mentioned in my opening remarks, that I think the DoD's eyes are wide open after many of the recent disasters and the impact on the installations, of getting into the conversation early and having those meetings. And Bryn brought up, like, we're planning 20 years out. This is an important conversation to have now, and not everyone is always at the table. And a reason of that is not always people know how to get there, why it's important, why this national security perspective is important, how they can be a champion for the community. And I've seen a lot of really great work from organizations like EEI and NRECA and NARUC, and I know those are all acronyms, but basically organizations that represent those co-ops or those utility providers, or those IOUs, to help them facilitate conversations with the installations that they serve, and having conversations that are secure and safe, but maybe with unclassified people, so that we can make decisions that are appropriate for the load growth that they're expecting. Thinking about how to have a regional discussion. Installations and the military is very stovepiped, like all big bureaucracies. So how to think about, like, Northern Virginia as an entire region and not just like the Navy, the Army, the Air Force installations. There's a lot of really great work through MOUs and studies and things like that. But I would say over the past year or so, we've seen that move from studies to action. And I'll just highlight one DoD organization. The Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation is old CC, another wonderful long acronym. They are in a unique position that they can invest Department of Defense money into communities for that infrastructure improvement outside the fence line, as long as it is tied back to the mission. And they have a nice wide scope, and they're very forward thinking about some of these future problems that Carrie and Bryn have touched on. So old CC, if you are a defense community listening, highly recommend you find your person there.
That is incredibly exciting. Thank you for sharing that. So talking a little bit more about the generation side of the equation, Bryn, can you talk a little bit about how different resources can make gas more efficient and affordable, and how do we sort of utilize some of these resources to decrease the timeline on clean energy development?
Yeah. I think the first thing that I think about is recognizing that we can't build as much gas as fast as some want, including some of these big loads. There's a big emerging discussion right now around how do we better utilize the gas on the system that we've already got? And that's a starting point. And it starts with recognizing that there's a lot of unused capacity on the system. We've got headroom because we build for these peak loads, the highest point in the demand curve. But outside of those hours, you have a lot of capacity sitting idle. And so to get new loads onto the system, the question is maybe, can you trade modest amounts of curtailment risk, times where you have to rely on backup generation, for example, in exchange for speed? And Carrie, you referenced this Duke study already, which maybe you could summarize the main conclusion from saying we could connect up to 100 gigawatts of load with an average of less than 1% curtailment time. So, that might average to something like 85 hours per year, typically with a 2-hour duration. And say, if you take that deal, mostly being able to serve load with some of this excess gas capacity and other generation resources, we can get you onto the system faster. And I think what's interesting about that is it sounds like a reasonable offer. Data centers, though, would have to build more operational flexibility in almost from the beginning. There are some opportunities to shift compute loads. Google's doing this a bit. Others are looking at building this type of flexibility into the data center design from the beginning, like a developer like Veris. The point is, it's going to take more time to develop this idea to make it work, come up with tariffs that even make it possible. Maybe it's targeted ultimately at more manufacturing loads that can be a little bit more inherently flexible. But the point is, the cheapest and fastest thing here would be to better utilize the gas infrastructure we've already bought and paid for. Yeah, maybe the other thing that I think about is, can natural gas provide some of that firming around the resources that we can build fastest? So that's solar, wind, and battery storage. And batteries are themselves a firming resource. They're a dispatchable resource. But gas can play a key role in sort of shaping that overall curve. And I think we're seeing big success. Carrie, you've already touched on this in states like Texas, where solar storage are providing record amounts of generation. And you throw gas into the mix and it improves reliability. So maybe the bottom line is a portfolio approach is going to be critical to better utilize, including the gas infrastructure that we already have.
I love that. I think you already answered part of this, but I want to point to the question on the chat for a second because I think it ties really well into this. And that's, what role should distributed energy resources and non-wire alternatives play in managing load growth? How can transmission planning incorporate these more effectively? And anybody can answer, but I guess I'm putting you on the spot, Bryn, since I think it ties in well to what you're talking about.
Well, maybe I'll just start briefly by saying, when you look at the studies of what's the fastest, cheapest way to get more resources onto the system, it tends to say utility scale is going to be the cheapest thing, and then moving it with some amounts of transmission. The less amount of transmission we end up building, the more you might rely on distributed energy resources. Those do tend to be more expensive on a dollar per kW basis, but it absolutely should be part of the portfolio, and we might end up having to lean on it more, especially if we end up building less transmission. And that might be because we can't clear some of the permitting hurdles. The supply chain bottlenecks just continue to remain slow. It's already been pointed out that it's really hard to get things like breakers and transformers, which you absolutely have to have. So that may pivot this portfolio back towards more localized or distributed resources.
I'll just pipe up because I used to live in the distribution world. That was my world for 5.5 years. I absolutely agree with Bryn, but I do think that there is some really interesting opportunities on the distribution side. We've seen energy efficiency play a really important role the last 20 years. I know we can only get so much juice out of the orange or whatever fruit you're thinking of, but there's probably more to be done there. There's a lot of conversation about virtual power plants, which is an interesting solution on the distribution side. The ability to, like, a region of the distribution grid to come together and like bid in or demand response. So there is some opportunity, particularly on the commercial and industrial side. These are sophisticated actors. Obviously, Bryn works with a lot of them, and they're able to really use a lot of this technology, and they're able to get into very sophisticated contracts and agreements that maybe an individual customer cannot or doesn't want to or unable to. So there is some ability, but I agree with Bryn. You want to go for the big solutions, and that's on the big grid, the transmission side.
Fantastic. I want to sort of end this portion of the webinar before we open it up for audience Q&A to, just pose a question for everybody. And Meredith, if you want to start, and we can shift to the rest. So how has your specific role sort of shaped your understanding of the way that, transmission efforts or other generations enhance national security or economic growth, et cetera?
Yeah, it's been really interesting to be a part of this conversation. And I started as, again, like inside the fence line, nitty gritty at building level, and thinking now at a transmission level, because building a reliable and resilient grid is essential, as I've said many times, to the national security mission and the Department of Defense, but it's not a single ratepayer benefit. It impacts everyone in that region, in addition to the community. And Bryn touched on the fact that capacity for growth and economic growth is becoming more and more rare, and that ability to build new commercial buildings and anything that's using energy, we're running out of room. And that is just, it's a big piece of national defense is a piece of this puzzle. And it's an important one. And I think one that hits home and aligns with a lot of the current administration's focus on energy dominance. And this is an opportunity to take advantage of that. There's really a great opportunity to bring folks to the table that maybe haven't thought about it before. And I'm just excited, with this conversation, as well as all of these great reports to hopefully, leapfrog into helping folks make connections and build out their story of why transmission and this time to invest in the energy infrastructure across the United States is so important. So.
Definitely. I share that sentiment. I know that in conversations with some of our conservative allies, both at the state and national level, that have never really been engaged in the energy industry or conversation, or haven't really taken those steps to educate themselves, are now fascinated by it because of the national security components. And so we find that that is an excellent message to really bring people to the conversation and pique their interest in why energy is so important. So that's really exciting. Carrie, how has your role, your current role and then your past roles, because I know you've been in this field from different sides, sort of shaped your understanding?
Yeah, I think, and I can also take a crack at the open question as well. I think when I was a regulator in Illinois, and I lived through a lot of either catastrophes or near misses, and not always in my state. I was watching Twitter live, if it was X at that point, when Winter Storm Uri was going down in Texas, and watching the catastrophic impacts. 265 people died. A 10-year-old boy froze to death in his bed. Horrific. And watched the steps after. I talked a lot to those Texas commissioners. They did a really great job of turning things around quickly. And now seeing the outcome, Texas has built, as I've already mentioned, more of clean energy resources than any other because of their ability to build, to put things online, threefold of solar and like tenfold of storage in a short amount of time in 4 years, which is incredible. And I'm seeing how that's going. I lived through Winter Storm Elliott, which I did get the personal calls from the RTOs telling me that it's about to go down. The lights are about to potentially go out. And that feeling of catastrophe and helplessness, it's too late when you get those calls. There's nothing I could have done, and there's only so much that they could have even done. And I learned a lot after the fact of what could have helped, what could have helped with some of the outcomes in Elliott. There were no major outages in Illinois, but there were a lot of bills to be paid for things that didn't show up, particularly gas. To the point about how gas plays a role how storage plays a role in gas electric coordination. I've learned a lot by talking to members in my organization of what that was like, what was happening in those 2 days of Winter Storm Elliott. There's a lot of times where there's a lag in the time when you nominate gas. It's really a complex gas system that you have to nominate it, and the gas has to start flowing, and sometimes that takes a couple hours. If storage were there, a couple hours is exactly the hole they could have filled. Or there was gas generators saying, you're telling me to turn off PJM, but I can't turn off because I'm worried my pipes are going to freeze. And they did indeed freeze. And again, like, these are places that storage could have fit in nicely. So I'm learning a lot of talking to my members, having a view of other markets. I talk a lot about Texas. I didn't know as much about Texas until this role. So taking the best from the markets that we're seeing really good outcomes and applying them to other markets is really, I think, really impactful. very quickly, what can state PUCs and or legislators do to help in getting RTOs talking more about transmission needs and planning? So there have definitely been some attempts. There's a FERC NARUC task force where federal commissioners and state commissioners get together and have these conversations. And FERC does have a lot of authority, but they need the political cover to do some of the things they need to do, particularly on interregional transmission. It's hard enough to plan transmission within one region. When you have two regions that have to figure out cost allocation, there needs to be direction from, I think, Congress to push it to FERC to figure it out.
And I'm sorry, Bryn, just because we're answering this question, I'd like to use my moderator privilege to sort of amend that question. Either Carrie or anybody else that wants to take a crack at it. I know, Meredith, that you're also typing an answer. Same question, but shaping in a non-RTO region. What can PUC or legislators do to help the conversation in a non-RTO area?
I mean, from my perspective, it starts with what's the most cost-efficient thing you should do as a state regulator? That's your job to think about. How am I protecting consumers while building out the grid? And doing the most cost-efficient planning takes you beyond just the boundaries of a single state or even a single utility. The most cost-efficient way to make sure that we're not building 5 lines when you could build one more cost-efficient line is to do regional planning. And I think a really key voice in that conversation is the consumers who pay for it, but also military bases or myriad other users of the system that say, we need a low-cost, reliable system. And that's what we should be building. That requires regional transmission planning. And my perspective on this is just to remember, we can do this because we've done it before. There's really good examples of how doing this type of longer term regional planning produce massive benefits. If you look at SPP in the middle of the country, they just announced a big tranche of transmission projects that have benefit to cost ratios of 8-to-1. MISO has long been kind of a leader in doing this type of long-term regional planning. They just announced their latest tranche of transmission projects that say they're expecting up to $72 billion in benefits for a $22 billion investment. So the bottom line is this type of approach, it benefits consumers, and cost allocation is hard. There's no question about it. But we've got to get on the same page about looking at what are the benefits that consumers can reap by working together in a more concerted regional approach. Because as we've been talking about for the last hour, transmission really is the linchpin to so much of the other things that will unleash addressing grid resilience and extreme weather, reducing congestion costs for consumers, and really ultimately capturing the economic growth, positioning for global competitiveness, and getting these innovative industries here. It all starts with that regional transmission planning approach.
I co-sign everything Bryn just said. That's like getting the customers to talk to their utilities about what they need, having a consistent message around the benefits, around not only national security, but the economic benefits, and then taking that to the regulators and helping them make those, giving them the cover and the okay to make those investments, you know.
And we're seeing this in Western expansion. I mean, it's actually happening, which is really incredible for people that have been in this space for a long time. We've been talking about the markets moving west, a true market for very long, besides CAISO, like for a very long time, and it's actually happening. And that is a lot of credit to the Western regulators getting together and talking it through. Cost allocation exactly is very, very hard to figure out. It's really hard to explain to, I mean, it's hard for a commissioner to explain to a customer of why your customers are paying for a transmission line that's 2 states away, to explain why, what value that brings. So it's not easy.
Definitely. Well, we have 1 minute left, but Bryn, you didn't get an opportunity to answer that last question of how has your role shaped your understanding of really the industry as a whole?
I mean, I think I wove some of what I would have said into the fact that we have demonstrated progress in how we've done this in other regions. It's really about listening to voices like customers who are saying, we pay for the system. What is going to be good for us? And I think you're starting to see customers really rally around the idea that we need to be making big investments in the grid. We need to be enabling all of this demand growth that's coming. But that does mean we have a bigger pie over which to spread all of those costs. We just need to have an honest and fact-based conversation about what is it that we need to build, what is the most cost-efficient things to build, and that means a combination of generation and transmission. If there's one takeaway from this whole conversation, it's a broad portfolio, diversified portfolio approach is going to win out every time. But mapping that out and recognizing that there are going to be benefits even while there's costs. And then when you look at it on a portfolio and a region-wide basis, that's when you can really recognize the moments where the customers are going to win out.
Thank you so much. Actually, that was a beautiful wrap up of the whole conversation. So thank you for taking us home, and thank you everybody for joining us on this gorgeous Thursday from wherever you're located. Really encourage you to check out the reports that were mentioned. The links are in the chat. We'll also send the links as a follow up. So thank you again, everybody, and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us.